All right, so we're back, and we're going to be talking about the laws in the Torah. We're doing the Decalogue. There are two primary types of laws, and the main two that we're looking at here are apodictic laws, and these are basically divine commands. You shall not murder. You shall not have other gods before me. You have case law is the other type of law, which is conditional laws. So you have, if you do this, if someone does this, then here is the proper response, the necessary response. Now, the relationship between these two is helpful to understand because case law typically grows out of the need to define and then flesh out the principles in apodictic commands. Um, we're going to see some examples in the Decalogue below. So in Hebrew, first of all, so let's go ahead and talk about the Decalogue. In Hebrew, the Decalogue, as it means literally, it's called the 10 words. Here, Decalogue just means, the 10 laws. In Hebrew, it's the 10 words or 10 things. And this is the earliest codification of laws in Israelite society, as far as we can tell. And the thing is, they're pretty vague, so they get expanded into what's now called the covenant codes. So that's basically the next 3 chapters following that. And there are a few different ways then of numbering the commands. Actually, you probably noticed if you take a look, if you took a look more closely, there are actually more than 10 in the 10 things or in the 10 words. And depending on the religious tradition, they're numbered a little bit differently. So some scholars and faith communities combine verse 3 with verses 4 to 6 to form one command. So if we're looking at that, verse 3 is, you will have no other gods before me. You will make no carved likeness and no image of what's in the heavens above or what's in the earth below or what's in the waters beneath the earth. So putting those two verses together, you get no other gods before me and no carved likeness or image of those gods. That's one command. But in other traditions, you will have no other gods before me as a separate command. Okay, then. There's another one where there's another way of reading it where you have I am the Lord your God is the first command, and then you will have no other gods beside me is actually the second command. In some forms, you will have no other gods before me is actually the first command, and I am the Lord your God is just a declaration. So there's different ways of doing this. Now, the command to covet is also alternately interpreted. So it can be in some cases, like in the Septuagint, in the Jewish Talmud, the Reformed Christian tradition, it's interpreted as a single command against coveting. You will not covet. In the Catholic Catechism, by Augustine, it's understood as separate commands against coveting one's neighbor's property and coveting one's neighbor's wife. Those are two different commands. Either way, the Decalogue is typically and traditionally divided into 2 tablets, since Moses is said to have come down with 2 tablets, although most likely those 2 tablets are the 2 copies of the same law. So it's, that the idea there is that you have 2 copies that are put on deposit, as we talked about. So it's probably the same thing written on each one. But in terms of the history of tradition, the laws are divided into 2 tablets. The first one deals with humanity's relationship to God. So you will have no other gods before me. You'll make no carved image. You will not bow down to them, etc. Remember the Sabbath day. These are all relationship to God. And then the other deals with interpersonal relationships, the horizontal aspect, humanity's relation with humanity. But there's a lot of ambiguities in the Decalogue here that we should talk about. And it's unfortunate we're doing this virtually, asynchronously, because this is usually a really fun part of the class more in person, because this is an opportunity to really discuss what these mean. But I'll do the best I can here to keep this lively. But the first thing is in verses 4 to 6, you have this prohibition against making carved images. It says, "You will make no carved likeness or image of what is in the heavens above, or what is on the earth below, or what is in the waters beneath the earth." Does that mean you're not allowed to make any image at all? So that means, any sort of art or carving or, heck, a television. You mean any of that stuff? That's completely out of bounds? No likeness or image of anything? Or is this simply the making of image of other gods? Or can you make an image for Adonai? So a carved image and likeness of what's in the heavens above and the earth below. So if you make an image of the image of humanity, let's say you take a picture. Is that okay? What's the meaning of then command 3 by one order? If you are to not make wrongful use of the name Adonai, what does this mean? And you've probably heard this more frequently. You will not take the name of Adonai, or the name of the Lord your God, in vain, right? That's what you have here in this translation as well. It's and so you have this declaration of God's characteristic. But you will not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not acquit whosoever takes his name in vain. What does it mean to take the Lord's name in vain? Think about that for a second. And this is where I'll usually ask the full class, what do you imagine? What have you heard involves making wrongful use or taking the name of the Lord your God in vain? So among these things, you might get someone who suggests that just saying God, or any sort of cussing that involves using the word God, or for Christians Jesus, these sorts of things. Is that what we're talking about? Is it wrong to say God damn it? Is that a violation of command 3? Well, it turns out that's not exactly what this is about. There's a couple things that are going on here. Number one, you notice that it says the name of, and then you've got the name of Adonai, your God, in vain. Saying God, whatever, God is generic. This is talking about the specific name of the specific God of Israel, and you are not to make wrongful use of that name. And specifically, take that name in vain. It's to make empty use of, or to take it upon yourself in vain, something like that. For emptiness, for empty purpose. So, first of all, it has nothing to do with God or any generic. It has to do with the specific name that we typically don't pronounce for that very reason, right? So that's the number one thing. And in one context, this probably in a civic context, has to do with the importance of being able to swear oaths. If you go before Adonai and you swear in the name of that God, and then you do not keep the oath that you've sworn, then you have discredited the name of that God. You have basically treated the name of that God. You've treated that God as though that God is nothing. So this is a prohibition against swearing false oaths in the name of the Lord first, in the specific name. That's the first and primary function. There's another level to this, though, that you can talk about in terms of the grammar here is that you will not take the name Adonai in emptiness. The taking of the name is actually a covenantal kind of concept that in a marriage covenant, for example, the bride takes the name of the husband. And to take the name of Adonai and then to violate the covenant in any other way is to make empty use again of the name. So that in itself is the idea that you are brought into this covenant with this specific God who is named, and then you violate the stipulations of the covenant, you have made empty use of the name. So those two things basically, and one is kind of a subset of the other, those two things basically amount to this, and it has nothing to do with cussing, for example. For what it's worth, that actually derives from language, basically from socioeconomic differences in different classes in England quite a while ago, where the upper classes spoke French or Latin, and the lower classes used the more coarse, the more vulgar. Vulgar is just a word that means common. It's a Latin word for common, actually. And they would use the more common words, the actual English words for body parts and actions and so on. But if you were in elite company or that sort of thing, you knew better than to use the common person's way of referring to these things, and so that was looked down upon as base and vulgar, as common rather than high class, and so ultimately that then is rejected as being low class. And then eventually that gets mapped on, interestingly, to piety. And so you have prohibitions against that for other reasons, but it grows out of the former. Now, then you've got the next thing. You've got Sabbath. What does work mean? It says, remember the Sabbath day to hallow it or keep it holy, make it holy. 6 days will you work, and then you will do your tasks, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to Adonai your God. You will do no task, you and your son and or no work, you might say, your son and your daughter, your male slave, your slave girl, your beast, your sojourner who is within your gates. Okay, so that's work. What is work? Those of you who are more on the hard sciences side know that there is a definition for work, right? So, but that definition isn't going to work so well, because breathing then constitutes work. Moving constitutes work. What counts as work? How do I know whether this is work or whether it's not? And you've got all sorts of discussions about this within the Jewish tradition as people are trying to make sure that they keep the covenant. But what counts? So that's ambiguous, right? Is it okay to turn a light switch on? Because is that kindling a fire, or is that actually work, or is it not? So that's an issue. You have another, and we'll talk some about these a little bit further. You have the command against murder, ratzah. So does that mean you are not to kill any human being? Well, what about war? Or what if it's an accident? Does that violate the covenant? What if I accidentally kill someone? Or does this mean, just cold-blooded murder? Or is there, what about capital punishment, which is then later on you have that in the Torah? How does that work? So, yeah. Then you've got adultery. You will not commit adultery. What counts as adultery? Right? I mean, some of you grew up in religious contexts where you're not supposed to mess around and all that. And, you kind of ask the how far is too far question. And, the same thing can be asked in adultery. Like, what counts as adultery? Like, I'm guessing, for example, that former President Bill Clinton's definition of adultery is somewhat different than the definitions that many of you have. When he said, I did not have sexual relations with that woman, well, I mean, what counts as sexual relations, and therefore what counts as adultery, right? Now, actually, in the ancient world, this adultery thing applied specifically to sleeping with, sexual contact with someone else's wife. Men, in general, were more sexually free at this time. You had that double standard that was in place, but having sex with someone else's wife was adultery. If the woman was unattached, that was a little bit different. Again, the woman swore sexual exclusivity. Typically, the men did not in this period. And these 10 commands assume a masculine audience, for what it's worth. And then, how exactly on these last 4 things are we supposed to? Are we supposed to, have how are we supposed to punish them? How are we supposed to know how that's going to handle things? I mean, false witness. And by the way, notice it does not say, thou shalt not lie, right? What does it mean not to bear false witness against your neighbor, right? Does that mean don't lie? Well, actually, I mean, if you think about the command about perjury, not making wrongful use of the name, this also, it has a specific social context, right? You are not to actually in the context of legal stuff, you cannot perjure yourself. You cannot claim that someone did or did not do something that they did that was the opposite, right? So that's another thing. And then you've got coveting. What in the world is coveting? This chamad word in Hebrew is very difficult. But I mean, how would you prosecute this? Right? I mean, you will not steal, you will not bear false witness, you shall not covet your fellow man's house. And by the way, you shall not steal, based on what we find later in the covenantal code. Rabbinic interpreters understand this as you shall not steal another human being. This is actually against kidnapping more than anything else, for what it's worth. But then you shall not covet your fellow man's wife, or his male slave, or his slave girl, or his ox, or his ass, or anything that, or his wife's ass, or anything that your fellow man has, right? That's the idea here. Well, how do you know whether someone has coveted his, fellow person's slave or ox or ass? How do you know? Well, here's the other thing about coveting. Coveting is probably best understood, and when we see this in elsewhere, when you see this word show up elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, it's not just a matter of like, I see it and I want it, or I wish I had it. It's, let me think of it this way. Let's imagine that one of my students I really dislike. And I decide that, this is pre-COVID era, so there are students on campus. And I decide I'm going to find out what that person's schedule is, and I'm going to wait, and I'm going to run that person over with my car. Finally, just going to be done with it. It's going to be an accident, right? An accident. But let's say this student is a very quick student. If I run him over and I kill him, then that's murder, right? I've violated the command. But let's say they're a very quick student, and they dodge out of the way, and they just, get grazed. Well, I haven't broken the law, right? There's nothing, I've done nothing wrong, right? Not exactly, right? That's the thing, is there's still, something. I might, for example, another illustration. You have someone who wants to blow up a government building. Having the thought of, such and such, that's not going to be prosecutable. Blowing it up, obviously, is going to be prosecutable. But you have other cases where, suddenly someone is discovered to have bomb-making equipment, blueprints, and, a journal that includes plans to do this in 2 weeks, all within his, mother's basement. All of that stuff would suggest that there's, something that's prosecutable there in our legal code. And that's the thing. If I try to run this person over and I fail, that's attempted murder. Or if you've got the bomb maker, that person is in the process of planning the attack. Those things are, and that basically gets us pretty close to what this catch-all, this 10th command is. In Jewish tradition, and that's why in Jewish tradition, the violation of that command is tantamount to violating all of them. You actually have that idea that if you violate the 10th command, you violated the whole law. And that's because essentially what coveting means here is you're not to try to do any of the things on the list. So when Donald Trump, for example, in the prior presidential election, there was that tape that was released about how he was trying to get with this married woman, but ultimately she turned him down and he couldn't get with her and all this. Well, he didn't commit adultery. But if he tried to commit adultery, that constitutes a violation of the 10th command in the way that this works. It's essentially the catch-all against attempting to do any of the things on the list. So you're not to do these things, nor are you to try. You're not to commit adultery, you're not to steal, nor are you to try to commit adultery or to steal or to take any steps or move your inclination in any way toward those things. And that's why this is actually prosecutable. You can see that someone's actually planning to take someone's donkey. You can see that someone's trying to get with someone's wife. But that's basically how all that works. So we'll talk more about the 10 commands and I'll field some questions when we get to our discussion session. But we also have one last thing that I want to cover, or two last things I want to cover in this video before we actually move on to the third video, and that is the golden calf episode. Now, this is a critically important. This is sort of the watershed moment in the Torah where Moses is up on the mountain receiving all of these instructions, and at that very moment when he's receiving the covenant, Israel, with the help of Aaron, is breaking the very things that in fact, the very first command, I am Adonai your God, you will have no other gods before me. And then the second thing along with that, you will not make a graven image. What do? They make graven images and declare that those are Adonai, or that is Adonai, actually. That golden calf is Adonai. And when Moses comes down, first of all, Moses intercedes with God, who says, I'm gonna kill them all. And Moses says, it's not gonna make you look the best, so stop. And Moses changes God's mind there. But when Moses comes down and sees what happened, he flips out and he shatters the tablets of stone, which is a symbolic way of representing that the covenant has already been broken. And this is a watershed moment in the history of interpretation. This is the moment when it's clear that Israel's not going to behave in the ways that they're supposed to within the covenant. And that the covenant itself is gonna be more complicated in the relationship between Israel and God. So this all happens, and a very, like I said, a very important thing. Beyond that, we have some legal layers that we should talk about. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. We'll look at some of this in our discussion session if you're interested. But there are different layers that are preserving different traditions that are essentially introducing case law precedents and legal codes to reflect how to interpret the older casuistic traditions. And we can actually see in some cases layers of this so that you can see how a law was updated or how an older tradition was updated to serve later needs. So, for example, you've got this law of what to do with a wandering ass, a wandering donkey, which then has to do with property rights, how you're going to treat your neighbors and all of that. You should read these 3 passages and take a look at how each of them deals with this potential context or with this potential issue a little bit differently. So the older covenant code presupposes an agricultural and pastoral economy, and you basically have this presumption that this is dealing with a member of a rival clan. In the Deuteronomic code, this is presuming a little bit more locality, and basically you have more interest in communal solidarity instead of you having the enemy of the covenant code who has taken who is potentially involved. You have the brother who is involved. And then in the Holiness Code in Leviticus, you have something beyond even the Deuteronomic community. You have this idea of dealing with, feuds and all of that within the community. So you have that you have a lot of differences here. Now, within the oldest layers of these laws, there's a lot of similarities between the laws of Hammurabi, the Babylonian king from about 1790 BCE, and laws in the Bible. So I've listed out the various laws of Hammurabi. If you're interested here, you can look those up and then take a look at the parallel passages in Exodus. It's really, really interesting. Most famously, you have the Talionis laws, the Talion laws that are that appear in both, which is the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth law. Within that, you also have the covenant code. You have various things. This is all stuff that you can take a look at the handout for yourself and work through some of that and see some of those differences in terms of the difference between urban and agrarian societies that you have in terms of the expansion of the Decalogue itself. But in terms of examples from the Covenant Code, I'll probably look at some of these in our discussion session. The most important thing that I want you to think about when you're coming into the discussion session is what's the point of the eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth law? What's the value of the Lex Talionis law, and what's it doing here? What's the point of it in context? So that's what we're gonna talk about. One of the things we're gonna talk about in our discussion session on Thursday. We'll talk about some of these other things in terms of just how all these laws fit together. Finally, what we're doing is we are looking at the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant. In Exodus, they basically Moses goes up and he sees this image of how things are supposed to be as he's meeting God on the mountain. And then he's given instructions for this tent or tabernacle where Adonai, the presence of Adonai, is going to meet with his people from here forward. And you get 16 chapters plus of the construction and details of the tabernacle, including the orders to build. You get interruption and delay by the golden calf episode, and then you have the construction, and it's meticulously explained on how this is all going. And it's one of those things where reading through and from a modern perspective, you're like, man, why all this detail on this? But it is important, and it's something that they spend plenty of time on. And finally, you have the construction of the Ark of the Covenant, which is, interestingly, it has images of cherubim, of these monstrous guardian deity type things that are there. It's interesting that you have a prohibition against images, but then you have this sort of image-laden object that then is specifically designated to be the throne on which Adonai metaphorically sits. So there's no image of Adonai, but there's an image of his throne on which the glory rests. And so that's where we're going to leave off. I'm going to go ahead and move into the next lecture shortly. I'll get that posted in a little bit. That is on the book of Leviticus and priestly and holiness theology, which will be plenty interesting. Trust me, it'll be a lot more interesting than you think.